The Experiential Edge, the show about learning by doing in higher education, with your host, Trevor Finch.
Welcome to The Experiential Edge, the podcast for post-secondary instructors looking for ideas, answers, roadmaps to building better learning environments. I'm your host, Trevor Finch. Today's students are incredibly informed, but often in fragments. They navigate a world of rapid-fire information, short-form media, and attention that is shifting constantly. Now, that environment can make it harder to connect ideas, evaluate what the trade-offs, and think strategically. In other words, the exact skills that business education is meant to develop. Experiential learning changes that dynamic. Instead of just absorbing concepts, students have to make decisions, test strategies, measure outcomes, and reflect on what worked and what didn't. Activities like simulations or other structured strategic assignments push students to connect the dots between strategy, measurement, and differentiation. So it turns passive consumption into active thinking. And that's where experiential learning comes in and why today's conversation really matters. All right, today's guest is Jean Beauchemin, professor of business and a program coordinator at the Douglas A. Smith Family School of Business at Cambrian College. Welcome, Jean. I'm really happy you could join us. And, it's funny when we first chatted about this topic, you, and I think I even mentioned in the email, we were all over the place, and I felt like we were maybe like our own students that we're talking about, and attention span shifting and moving. It just seemed to be very apropos. So, I think instructors like yourself and myself, we really do feel like those learners are shaped by that rapid fragmented media. So rather than just say, hey, this is what it is, what changes have you noticed in the last bunch of years in terms of how students are processing information?
Right. I think it's a product of their environment and how they consume not only what's been pushed out to them through the channel in which they spend the most amount of time on. And a lot of times it not only is it about what they're consuming, but what's easy for them to access. But what's also key is how they're accessing it. They're doing it on a screen that is less than 6 inches. So it allows them to, and that's got, get scrolling and it becomes kind of a way of life. And how you consume information in a short period of time doesn't allow you to not only take a step back and understand the cause and effect of why that those pieces of information or that media or in an educational setting, that concept is there, but its relationship to kind of other factors as well. So it takes a more of a strategic effort in the classroom, or when you're even in professional development or training, to be very not only clear in what you're trying to achieve, but also creating an environment where we all slow down to understand what we're trying to accomplish at the end of the day, and create an environment where we can utilize those pieces of information or that technology in a right way, but to support it with an ability for students to think about the connectivity of different concepts together. So takes time in order to plan that out, but it also takes an environment where you've been able to break down some of the barriers that have been, organically created through, through the way that we then communicate information. So when breaking down those barriers means that you need to have an ability to develop rapport with students, trust, and once they trust you and there's that likability that I'm going to get something out of this, then those whatever you want to call it, barriers come down and you can kind of dig in a bit more.
It's interesting you say that, and I think that's a great point. But right at the very end, you talked about, there's an expectation from the students of us. And, I remember going through, adult education certification process. And the first thing that was taught to us was that adult learners are different than, high schoolers and what else. They've got a reason for being there, right? They're not just forced to be there. They have expectations out of us. But those expectations haven't changed in terms of they want to get an education, they want to get the skill set, they want to get whatever else, and they want to be able to learn that. But how they consume media and how they approach the world has changed. So I remember when I was last teaching. I do remember, sitting around with some instructors talking about, well, I hear in the comments, like, they just don't get it. They just don't get it. So it's not that they're dumb, right? Like
No, no.
they don't get it, but it's because there's something they're missing, right? There's something that they can't grasp. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think they're actually many of them are very intelligent, probably more intelligent than we were when we were at the stage in their lives. And just the interaction is a different one. Let me dig in and explain a little bit. So when I
Yeah.
did my first undergrad, I was at the University of Guelph, and I remember English was my second language. And at the time, you know, I it was very new to me, right? And I remember sitting in a lecture hall of 500 plus students, and there's a professor at in this lecture hall. He's going all this, and he's got the wool red sweater on and the chalk, and there's chalk everywhere, and
Oh yeah.
this, and the interaction was like, hey man, show up, and I'm gonna write a bunch of stuff on the board, and the ability for you to pass this course, you gotta show up, who's gonna take the best notes. And it was a one-dimensional learning process where it was almost like show me that you can regurgitate this to a certain extent. And there was, professors at different levels at that time, but technology and the way that education was approached and where other information was available, limited students' ability to go not only get that information in another way,
Yeah.
but also challenge what's been said there. So to me, going back to your original question and what you're getting at is that I feel like the students today are a lot smarter and more engaged than once more, which ultimately needs to, if I need to know if we just talk about marketing for a second, because it's a concept that most people can understand. I remember in my first marketing class, this professor was saying, okay, the 4 Ps are, and if a student needed that from us, and that's what, as professors, we brought to the table, then so be it at that point in time. But today, if they want to know what the 4 Ps are, they have multiple different ways to just utilize this and get it in probably a cleaner way that I can put on whatever it is. Or at the time, it was like, I'm writing it on the board, or it's this overhead thing with old school slides that rinse and repeat. Not only are the students able to get that information a lot better, a lot cleaner, a lot right now. So then you need to ask yourself, and like, okay, well, if that's the case, my role's really evolved a lot, that I need to bring a heck of a lot more to the table than that.
Yeah.
So there's professors that might, based on the subject matter, their experience in industry, I think is a huge factor here, and it will bring, and their passion for really challenging themselves into the uncomfortable, take different approaches to engage their students in a learning experience that goes beyond having just talking about concepts in a one-dimensional way. So I think there's more there from the student. They expect more.
Yes.
They want more. They the right ones in the right way are going to challenge you to be better. And
Yeah.
I feel like that's a really good thing. We're going through a process of evolution here, and we're going to hit, I think, sort of a landing spot where the best practices will be kind of reestablished, if you will. But right now, with the advent of AI and what that student looks like, we're through a transitional stage. So experimental learning allows you to not only challenge the students, but to really look in the mirror and challenge yourself to say, am I putting out the best I possibly can be? And I think in itself, that is probably the best lesson that you can teach your students as they transition into the business work environment.
Well, exactly. And because that's what we do in the workplace, right? And, I remember graduating from college and university and then moving into the workplace, and you've got that core set of skills. But when it comes to actually doing the work, you have to put in the work, and it's trial and error, and you get guidance, whatever else. There's no way you're going to walk into any job from any education and be able to know how to do absolutely everything. There's has to be some sort of mentorship, some sort of learning on site. And we're doing the same sort of thing. The difference is, I feel like it's odd because back in the day, you were talking about, the old lecture style. Like one of the reasons I remember a professor, I swear I can remember this, where he kind of went, look, you guys have to learn, you have to read the textbook. It's not like you can walk around with a textbook in your hands. Well, guess what? You can walk around with a textbook in your hands now. So I had a conversation with Matthew Schonweil, who is an AI expert, and we recently recorded a podcast. And we talked about where is the cognitive load from students right now. It's different than when it was we had to learn in our generations to learn how to memorize and those kind of things. Well, they don't need that. They can shift, they can get that information so quickly, but they're shifting their cognitive load to different areas. And, if you're in I joke, I call it the 10-bit generation, all those things, kind of where people are shown where to go. Sometimes that's the skill that's lacking is where do I find that information? How do I go ahead and get it and how I do it? And that's really where I think you've shown that experiential learning kind of helps. So
Yeah, it certainly does. To me, it becomes about what are we doing here? What is the end in mind? And to
yeah,
me, it's full stop about the student and what they leave here with. My goal when I deliver a course, so the type of courses that I'm teaching, like let's say this semester, right? There's a strategy course that I'm teaching, higher level consumer behavior stuff. Is it really about those materials and what they learn in that class about that subject? Or is it about more the soft skills that they will need to transition into today's workplace, where not only do they need to do more with less based on the environment in which businesses are operating, but employers are looking for people that they can rely on and grow within their organization. So if there's a thirst that has been developed by the student to not only understand the interconnectivity of different aspects of a business and how they all fit together, but more so a curiosity, which is one of my things that I like to talk about. Somebody that's got a level of curiosity that allows them to bring different solutions to the table and leverage all of the tools that they have to ultimately make their workplace and those around them culturally, their ability to interact with other people, their ability to build relationships externally and internally, the ability to understand a culture and a value proposition and to go and deliver it, the ability to deal with customer conflict resolution or internal conflicts and those types of things is really what separates a good employee from a great one. And
absolutely.
ultimately, an individual that does those types of things finds themselves like they're more progressive in their role, they're more successful because they've achieved more things. And for most individuals, they show up to work wanting to really do good by their employer, good by their teammates, good by the role that they have. And the more that they have ability to dig into certain things that actually produce real outcomes, the more that they're going to enjoy their work. The more that they enjoy their work, the more discretionary effort that they want to put in, the more invested that they are. They're not just showing up and doing what they need to do based on their job description. They're going above and beyond, not because they have to, but because they really love what they do and because they want to. They're doing it because they got a teammate's back on something. Just knowing stuff used to separate you from the crowd now, right? To my customers and how to use those items in certain applications, whatever. Today, it's important, but it's probably less important because they can throw it in ChatGPT and get 25 different ways to utilize chicken wings, if you will, or whatever the case is. Ask her, well, if that's the case, and I'm not just an order taker, what am I doing to provide a higher level of value? Realistically, it's interconnection of different concepts that will allow, like in that world there, somebody to take on more of a consultant role because they can connect not only the quality of a product in what I was talking about and in its application to a marketing capacity, to a financial outcome or forecast or whatever, and to a human resources in operation, and all of these types of aspects of a business or key pillar of a business need to act in harmony. And those that can connect those dots once they graduate or into the classroom where they're practicing to learn those concepts, or when they roll into junior positions, graduating and then progress. So if we go back to the beginning and say, what the heck am I doing here as a faculty? Probably should be focusing on yes, within the context of that subject matter, to challenge those students to have fun in an experiential environment, to practice these types of things, which is what the industry is going to demand of them.
Yeah. And in a fairly risk-free way. I used to tell my students, I'd rather you fail in my classroom than when you go into your first job. So I think it's very important And I agree with you. Experiential learning is definitely a great way to connect those dots. You and I have discussed, and I know you've got countless examples of how you bring experiential learning techniques into the classroom in these specific ways. But if you had to pick like a top three, let's just say,
Yeah.
what would you say are some of the classroom approaches that you've used that you kind of see really helps those students connect the dots?
Yeah. I'll go through a few of the examples of the things that I've found have worked well. I have tried multiple things, and I'll end it with bringing that back together on this statement to what we had talked about students having a space where they feel that it's fun to not get things right or fail, whatever you want to. So I want to make sure that we capture that at the end. I will use some recent examples of this, like one from actually this week. So typically what I do is I do an opening activity with the students that introduces the concepts, has them think about in many of the things that I talk about. I try to do everything I can to utilize local businesses that would fit that. So this week in a consumer behavior class, we were talking about buyer personas and customer journey mapping, the connection between the two.
Yeah.
So I put together different local businesses that they would be aware of that were close to the college. And we did some research about what those businesses are. In one case, actually, I picked a few businesses on campus. So we went down and we went and checked out. I go, look who's here and look who's so. And then I had a few different examples where they would then line up the buyer personas. So it's really a more detailed targeted audience to the product in itself and how it's been differentiated from the core of its main competitors, and how then it's then positioned so that you can really articulate the value of that buyer persona and link it back to what am I going to solve as a problem for that customer. So we do that, always do an introductory activity where I'm not talking at them, but we're having a discussion. What typically happens is it gives me, especially this is a degree, in this case, it's this 9th semester degree course, gives me a better understanding of where we're starting.
Yeah.
Because, they should have taken courses that find that there's a gap sometimes in what they remember, what they were, that kind of stuff. So it gives me kind of a bit of a point in which we know where we're starting. Then we identify key learnings that are like linked to the learning objectives. We talk about those and we go, hey, by the end of this session, and it depends on the course, and this course usually in a 14-week cycle, we're going to have 7 major topics.
Yeah.
And then we'll divide, in each major topic learning outcome, we'll have 3 learning objectives, and we're covering those 3 by a week kind of thing. So that kind of thing. So then what we tend to do is, so now that's the introduction. I then have them read. Textbooks have got their place, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But for the kind of stuff I teach, like trends in consumer behavior, if I went and got a recent publication, let's say there's one that's, 24. Realistically, that's been written in 2021 and edited and whatever by the time it goes to production. I'm already non-relevant to my
Yes.
remember who we're talking to where we started, right?
Yes.
So I tend to not do that. So what I traditionally do is I have a lot of materials I already have theory-wise. We read an article that's like a week old related to that topic. So if it's buyer personas in this example, then I'm going to use a couple different examples of how key things that came out in the news would have that. I have the students read the article at that point in time and then break out into groups on what they would share. Sometimes what we do is with those articles is I'll have and this is a bit old school, but it kind of works. Either we have boards on the classroom and they write things on, like there's a bunch in where we are, or we have TVs that are there, or it's literally a piece of paper, and I'll put the question related to that when they're reading the article, and they add 1 point to that. And as they're reading, I go, okay, flip. They have 2 minutes. They give theirs to the next student, and the next student gives it to them. And usually it's in like 4 or 5 groups, depending on the number of students. And then the last student reads what's been put on there from reading that article, and they can't replicate the point that they got out of based on what objectives. So now we're into a little bit more engagement. Again, I'm not talking at them as much because they're going to tune out, man. So if they tune out, then and then we then cover off the theory. And then from there, we get into a more robust case study or an application activity, or like I'll give you what we did on Monday. is, so buyer personas, I wanted them to link up the type of person that would be and develop a buyer persona on a business that I provided to them. So there's 6 businesses that they had, and we went to the mall. This is what we did. It's across the street. I'm like, "Hey guys, if you want to go for on a little mini field trip?" So we went across the street to the mall, and they each had 2 businesses that they needed to go. They need to go experience the business. They might know something about it. And then based on what that is and what they thought that student, that core audience would be for that particular product. So for example, roots, they would have to design a buyer persona for it.
Mhm.
And then we sat in the whatever, the food court at the
At the
mall,
mall.
and we went through them, and that's it. So then that is then linked to one of their assignments that's coming up. So that's kind of an example of something that I've done that's sort of tied in over a course that helps you kind of have a scaffolding
Yeah.
regime to it, and puts in a student in a position where they're having a little bit of fun while learning from their teammates, and get away from the sort of monotonousy, especially in courses like that. So that's an example.
Well, and let's just stick on that for a second for a minute, because I do want to point out that where I think this becomes really critical. The whole point of this, like this activity, I know I've done something similar, but the difference is we don't leave the classroom. We don't go and see these places.
Mhm.
That is that's the key. That's the experiential learning part that students can now connect to, because it's not just things on a paper, right? And you talk about these examples. I hate when text gives examples of huge businesses, multinationals. I'm like, okay, this looks great in scope, but how is this applicable? And you're looking at billions of dollars in sales and blah blah. When a student walks into a business, they're going to get a much better connection. And when they look and they see the individual customers. Buyer personas, I remember working from buyer personas and looking at them. And I worked for an organization. I used to be involved, a customer before I worked there. And I looked at these buyer personas. I'm like, I know intimately the different kind of customers we have. There's no way these are accurate.
Yeah.
And they were built from data, which is great.
Mhm.
I love data. I'm a huge data hound. But what they didn't do is what you're talking about, which is they didn't actually go out and actually talk to people, look at people, and understand what it is. And that's where those light bulbs go off.
Yeah. And then the other part that's been great and been very fortunate to have industry relationships is either we bring in business owners to do work on their behalf in the classroom. For example, had a marketing higher level marketing course where we were focused on building marketing plans. So we had 5 different businesses that in different industries that we developed marketing plans for them. And the students would have to present those plans to the business owners. But also, when possible, we do everything that we can to have the students, and again, it depends on the industry, but to be able to visit with the leaders of those organizations
Mhm.
on site, right? At their business. If we're in a business like food service distribution, it would be awesome for the students to not only see the warehouse and all this is done in the processes, but to talk about some of the challenges that those leaders are dealing with today. So, for example, in that business, there's a huge seasonality component. So, how do you ramp up inventory as you get into the summer? How do you look at that from a financial perspective, knowing that your volume is going to go up 30 to 40%, and you need that inventory on site, but your
Yeah.
cash flow hasn't really caught up to it. So how do you make sure that you buy the right product, not to lose out on those sales and not to short your customers? Because if you're doing that, you're going to go elsewhere, and your credibility and reliability and all those types of things, not only the lost sales, but you got to invest in that inventory. So how do you do that financially while maintaining, the right operational capacity? Like, those are the types of things that owners are looking at, going, okay, I got a marketing guy that's pushing really hard on sales conversion in this category, but operationally, can we handle those
Yeah.
conversions? And once they hear it from those individuals that are doing it day in and day out, it's something that they can get and understand, and related to the subject matter that we were discussing at that point in time. There's a lot of front end work there from a pedagogy or faculty perspective, and take the time to link back the way that the lessons are developed, to then say, okay, see
Yeah.
what this guy's dealing with? Here's what we did in our simulation. And as an example, that's
Yeah,
very similar. He's looking at the same stuff you are. So what decision would you make now in that situation? What decision would you make now if you were him?
that's right.
And if it was your money, right?
You know what? I love that you brought up that whole concept of work and learning and doing projects for clients, because I remember I did a couple work and learning projects, and using one of those online kind of things where, hey, we're looking for students to do this for us, and you connect it, and that was all fine. It seemed interesting, but the reality is it's harder for them to get through that process of understanding for a business that is in some other location. Often it's in a technical application. It's something that doesn't relate to them. They can't understand it. As opposed to the next time I focused on getting a whole bunch of local groups. And even if the businesses weren't, I'm going to say they weren't the most exciting in the world, but they got to talk to the owner and they got to talk directly to the people making the decisions. They got to connect the dots. So having that personal connection, like what you're talking about, I think is so important. Of course, you can't just read that out of a book or get it from software. Of course, says the guy who works for an e-learning software company, but that's regardless.
Well, it's all you use those tools that you have, right? I use the Praxar simulation. I believe in them. I think it's a really great tool, but where the rubber hits the road is when you're able to utilize it as a tool
Yeah.
and that it's linked into other aspects to bring that alive. I've seen it happen before where simulation is just used for the last 3 weeks, but the students are just going through the motions. It's when you challenge them to step outside and, whoa, you did this. This is the result that it produced. Then what is it telling you? So
Yes.
in your simulation, I have my students in their first assignment create a brand for like I'm using the golf one and basically create a strategy to bring this product to market under this positioning of this brand. But as part of that assignment as well, what we have them do is create like a KPI matrix that measures the outcome of their performance in a manner that they're applying what they've learned in their Excel courses and all that.
Yes.
And I make them go through the painstaking process of not just downloading a report, but having to fill it in manually. And
Yeah.
I was with students helping them with the simulation at 9 this morning because I had 2 student group that needed some guidance, and that came up. And when they looked at the results of their financial statement, and I was able to explain that to them in a different way in a smaller group setting, they brought up to me the sheer importance of going through those that process. As much as they might find it a little bit cumbersome at the beginning, they really enjoy it once they buy into the value of it. And really seeing one thing to teach a student that you should make this decision based on this perfect scenario, but what do you do when there's forces pulling you in multiple different directions and there's investment risks and cash flow issues and
Yes.
receivables and and all those types of things, which are literally what they will be dealing with the first day that they hit the workplace. And
Yeah.
and where I live, I feel like colleges like Cambrian College, which are community colleges, are a really important part of that community. And as much as we rely on our community to support us, we have an opportunity there to not only create these experimental learning opportunities for students by creating these partnerships, but also to give back to the communities that might require help in the area that we can provide expertise.
Yes.
Why wouldn't we do that?
And it's an important point. Obviously, like I work with and post secondary is university colleges, and colleges do, especially in some smaller communities or in areas that don't have large congregations of post secondary institutions. It really is a feeder for the business world, and it's not like you're sending a student out to work on the other side of the world. Some of them might be, but literally, your students are walking out and working at companies that you yourself might be a customer of. So it's important for the community that we're giving those students those opportunities. What I thought, I just want to touch on this before we wrap up, but
Mhm.
you talked about the simulation, and I just think it's fascinating. I really enjoyed you showing me how you get the students, they take the data, right? And we all love data, but they create the like you said, the KPIs, and they create their own dashboard, they build their own visualizations. And even though it's the same information, right? I remember you saying that even though it's the same information, but because they've had to manipulate it, change it, and adjust it to what they feel they need, that level of understanding goes to a whole new level. And that's what I found.
Well, then when they have to input it and take that time to do it and look at it, then now they own it, right?
That's right.
As opposed to just something that they've downloaded and then it's just a byproduct of something else. It's less, I don't know, less real to them. And I think it goes back to the beginning of where that student has been introduced to information in a completely different way that what we know. So that, think about it. So just like that student has been conditioned to always have the things that they want at a tip of their fingers, right? That downloadable income statement, for example, it's just that same kind of thing. In the olden days, you had to type it all out, do whatever. And then as you're going through those motions, you're engaging with the information over time. And, to put students in a position that they need to go through those steps allows them to, better understand it as they're going through and to feel more connected to the information and to better understand it. That's the most awesome part of teaching is being in an environment where you can continue to learn yourself. I feel like I'm learning as much from the students as they are from me at times, which is quite a blessing.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Jean, for joining us today, sharing your insights. Conversations like this kind of remind us that, experiential learning isn't just about making classes more engaging, which we all want, but it's actually helping students practice the kind of thinking that they need in the real world, right? And it's the kind of thinking, right? So I really appreciate it. We're going to have some little examples for people to check out on our website, experientialedgepod.com. I want to thank you, listeners, for listening to another episode of the Experiential Edge. It's a go-to podcast for actual ideas on experiential learning. Stay on the edge, people.
You've been listening to the Experiential Edge. For more tips, tricks, and ideas from this episode, go to experientialedgepod.com.
Produced and distributed by the Sound Off Media Company.